Okay, so now let's look at what are the properties of a good measure of dispersion. Now, dispersion is what? Dispersion indicates the extent of scatteredness of all individual items around a measure of central tendency, that is your mean, median, mode. A good measure of dispersion thus should actually possess all the characteristics of a good average, should actually come from all the characteristics of good average. Now, so hence it should be simple to calculate and should have a rigid formula to it, a well defined formula to it. It should be well defined. What else? Now, it should be based on all the items of the data. Now, more importantly, it should have sampling stability. It should have sampling stability. Now, what do we mean by that? That is, it should be affected as little as possible by fluctuations in sampling. In fact, this is the property that ascertains that the same measure of dispersion calculated from different samples of of the same population must be actually same. If you are trying to look at, you have a population, you take out samples and you see the dispersion, it should actually be equal for all samples. Now, and another very important part, it should not be affected by extreme values. Okay, now it should not be affected by extreme values. Now, what are the types of dispersion? The measures of dispersion are said to be of two types. You can express it in absolute terms, in either absolute form or relative form. Now, what do we mean by absolute measure? By absolute measure, we mean that when it is expressed in the original data units, like, for example, rupees, kilograms, milliliter, when you have it in certain unit form, then it is known as measure in absolute terms. So, it is said to be relative. Now, when do you call a measure of dispersion relative? It is relative measure when it is the ratio. When it is the ratio of an absolute measure, At that point of time, you call it a relative term, and it is a ratio of absolute measure to an appropriate average. And it is independent of the unit of measurement. So it is independent of rupees, kg, it can be anything for that matter. It is sometimes also known as what? The coefficient of dispersion. Now this relative is known as coefficient of dispersion. Now, what are the absolute types? Now, absolute types are essentially range. You have range, you have quartile deviations, also known as semi-interquartile range, or you have mean deviation. Mean deviation is there. Now, very important, standard deviation. Standard deviation is there, and you also have a graphical representation of it, which is known as Lorentz curve. These are all absolute measure. What about the relative measure? The relative measure would be, for example, coefficient of range. So the coefficient of absolute. So coefficient of range, coefficient of quartile deviation, coefficient of standard deviation, coefficient of mean deviation, or coefficient of variation of, standard deviation and variation are related concepts. So coefficient of standard deviation or variation, coefficient of mean deviation as well.